At the end of 1918, the Great War is over, but in Europe, on the now silent battlefields, there are new nations and new leaders springing up, and those battlefields will soon see a lot of renewed warfare as those nations fight each other or fight themselves in civil war. Welcome to Between Two Wars, a chronological summary of the interwar years covering the life, uncertainty, hedonism, and euphoria of the 1920s, the descent of that life into the poverty, suspicion, fear, and autocracy of the 1930s, and ultimately humanity's descent into the darkness of the Second World War. I'm Indy Neidell. As soon as the Great War is over, a huge change comes over Europe. In the vacuum created when the Central Powers collapsed and the Russian Civil War rages on in the East, new nations arise. Poland becomes independent again after 123 years of partition. Czechoslovakia becomes a republic. A Hungarian Democratic Republic is declared. Latvia declares independence from Russia. The British military government of Palestine begins. Montenegro becomes part of Serbia. Iceland regains independence from Denmark. Transylvania again becomes part of Romania. The Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes is established. Now, it's important to note that although these lands have in some way maybe existed before in history, they have never been nation states, nor have they ever been truly independent. Most certainly they haven't been constitutional democracies, not ever. They arise out of the ruins of an old system of feudal allegiances, where the land might have had the name they adopt when they become countries, but rather than countries, they had been the land dependencies of a complex system of more or less interrelated dukes, princes, kings, queens, emperors, and empresses. In the past 200 years, some of them have achieved some representation of the people, but were never self-governing. Some of them, like Poland, might have been independent kingdoms for a while at some point. But even then, they were the lands of some family, not the lands of the people. There has been much research on the concept of national identity, right? The majority of historians today agree that before the 18th century, there was no such thing. Some studies even indicate that a widespread sense of nationality doesn't arise until shortly before the beginning of the 20th century, or even only with the World War. During the 19th century, there was, though, a concerted effort by politicians and intellectuals to promote national identity, especially as identity politics almost always connects with interest politics. This all contributed to the complex web of conflicts that led to the Great War. Now, after that war, or perhaps because of it, that has pretty much succeeded, and nationalism is the standard way of looking at the world. But there's a problem. Although the nationalist movement has already created a definition, or actually many conflicting mythical definitions, of what these new nations are and where they came from, reality is much more complex. In Central and Eastern Europe, where many new nations now arise, there has been a balance held in place since 1648 and the Peace of Westphalia that settled the previous identity conflict between Protestants and Catholics within the Habsburg Empire. The idea is that national identity is based on some mix of ethnicity, geography, religion, whatever else. Unfortunately for the now fervent nationalists, there are no natural borders on which to base these new divisions. If the lines have ever existed at all, they've never been clear. So no matter which way you cut it, a lot of people with any given language and common cultural identity will end up on the wrong side of some border. And you move that border a little to fix that, and it's another language group that gets split instead. Now, this might sound trivial to those who are not affected, but it's certainly not to those who feel strongly about national identity. And in 1918, some people are starting to feel very, very strongly about national identity. So this is not some academic analysis or political opinion from our time. It's a real, tangible issue that will have catastrophic effects. You see, people will start wars over this, steal each other's property, rob them of their rights, incarcerate, torture, and mass murder each other over identity starting now in the autumn of 1918 as the new borders are drawn. And Germany, that last man standing that finally stopped fighting the war on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, well, a week before that happens, sailors of the Imperial High Seas Fleet mutinied in Kiel. The mutineers were imprisoned, but thousands of civilians marched in the streets demanding their release. Shots were exchanged and over 30 men were killed or injured. This is usually seen as the beginning of the German Revolution, which soon broke out in cities like Wilhelmshaven, Hanover, Braunschweig, and Munich. Actually, in Munich, a workers' council forces the last king of Bavaria, Ludwig III, to abdicate, and a Bavarian free state is declared. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II is also forced to abdicate, and a revolutionary council of people's deputies is proclaimed, led by the Social Democrats and Friedrich Ebert. While revolutionary forces continue to fight for regional Soviet-style republics, the moderate parties under Ebert are fighting for a democratic federal union. For all practical purposes, Germany is now at civil war. Another nation at civil war is Russia. After the November Revolution of 1917, the Bolshevik leadership under Lenin had withdrawn from the World War. The Brest-Litovsk Treaty gave Germany huge swaths of land all over Eastern Europe, which had, with Germany's defeat, become many of the new Eastern European nations. Some regions also seceded from Russia during the Civil War, while counter-revolutionaries tried to turn the tide. The by now fairly well-organized Bolshevik forces, the Reds, face a mess of different counter-revolutionary factions, the Whites. Now these imperialists, Democrats, proto-fascists, monarchists, and God knows what else, are fighting bitterly not only against the Reds, but also for control of the war between each other. While Germany and Russia continue to burn and nations form all over Europe, there's also unrest in many other parts of the world. In China, the new republic that had deposed the emperor in 1912 is already falling apart. Although the Republic of China still exists officially, in reality, the country is now under control of local warlords. Other parts of China are under Japanese control. Japan had fought on the side of the Allies in World War I and expanded its influence on the Asian mainland and in the Pacific. Together with the US, they're now involved in eastern Siberia in an attempt to stop the Bolsheviks from establishing control of the Russian Pacific Rim. On the Japanese home islands, a fragile democracy had been established in 1912, but the Taisho democracy is now under threat from a popular rise of fascism striving for expansion and militarization. In India, Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, France and Britain have tightened their control over their colonial dependencies. Nevertheless, there is increasing unrest as the peoples of these regions watch new independent nations arise all over the rest of the world. In the Middle East, the British have made the Emir Faisal king of Greater Syria, a British dependency. They've also promised him a new pan-Arabic nation. This is a reward for uniting the Arab tribes, together with Lawrence of Arabia, on the side of the Allies against the Ottoman Empire and the other Central Powers. But the intricate web of financial interest, oil fields, and agreements like Sykes-Picot that divides up the region between France and Britain, or the Balfour Declaration that promises a Jewish state in Palestine, now stand in the way of a united Arabia. So, as 1918 ends, the armistice of World War I is not yet a peace treaty, nor is there any peace, and it will stay like this for some time.